Welcome to the Leadership and Learning Podcast with Dr. JBT, where we dive deep into the art of leadership for emerging and advancing leaders. Whether you're just starting out or looking to sharpen your skills, this podcast is your go-to resource. We'll explore real-world scenarios, actionable solutions, and expert advice with insights drawn from Dr. JBT's own experiences and interviews with seasoned leaders. If you're serious about growing as a leader, you've come to the right place. Welcome back to Leadership and Learning with Dr. JBT. Recently, a team member asked me a really important question, one that every leader will face at some point. She said, "What do I do when someone on my team says something inappropriate to me?" It could be a snarky remark, a passive-aggressive comment, or something just plain rude. She explained that in the moment, she was so caught off guard, she couldn't think of a response that felt appropriate. And to make it more complicated, others were in the room, so she wasn't sure if she should address it right then or wait until later. My first response to her was simple. We have all been there. Yes, we have. And these moments can be incredibly difficult. No matter how much leadership experience you have, these moments test your composure, they test your confidence, and sometimes even your sense of self. So if you've experienced something like this, you are not alone. In fact, I want to share two moments from my own leadership journey where this happened to me. One of them I handled really well, and the other, not so much. I still remember that first situation vividly, even though it happened almost 20 years ago, because it became a pivotal moment in how I lead. Let's start with the situation I wish I could have handled differently. I was a brand new leader to a team that just, quite frankly, did not want me. Not one person on the team was happy that I was their new leader. And it wasn't personal. It wasn't about me. It was about who I replaced. Their previous leader was someone they deeply respected and cared for. He had been their mentor, their advocate, their friend. And when he left, I became a daily reminder that he was gone. I represented his absence, and that was not well received. When I first met with each of them one-on-one, several made it clear that they didn't need me. They said things like, "I already know how to do my job. You don't need to worry about me." As someone who values collaboration and growth and teamwork, I was taken aback. But I stayed optimistic. I thought, okay, they just need to get to know me. And then came our very first team meeting. I went in with a plan, of course I did, and I thought it was a good one. I wanted to start on a positive note, to focus on brainstorming and learning what each person was prioritizing that week. So I began. I turned to the first person on my left and asked, "What is your focus for the week?" She replied, "Our customers." I said, "Oh, that's great. What specifically about customers?" She looked right at me and said, "Customers." I tried again. Still nothing. So I smiled and decided to move on to the next person. Before she could even open her mouth, the first person jumped in again and said, "Customers." I paused and said, "Well, I'd love to hear from everyone individually." And that's when she said it. Everyone's focus is customers. I looked around the table and every single head nodded in agreement. And in that moment, I realized something important. The person to my left wasn't just a team member. She was the leader, and everyone else followed her lead without question. I decided to pivot. I said, "Okay, let's move on to brainstorming." I threw out a question, something open-ended to spark ideas. Silence. No one said a word. I waited. Still nothing. I didn't want to be the first person to put something on the board, but I thought, okay, I will need to model the behavior I want to see, so I went first. And before I could even finish my sentence, the same person interrupted and said, "That won't work." And you can imagine how the rest of the brainstorming went in that meeting. No ideas, no energy, and clearly no trust. Just silence and resistance in that silence. That meeting ended awkwardly and unproductively. I remember walking out so frustrated and embarrassed and wondering what I could have done differently. And, to be frank, why did I take this job? Now, before I share what I should have done, I want you to pause this episode for a moment and think about that situation. You're the new leader. The team doesn't want you there. One person dominates the group. Every attempt to collaborate is shut down. What would you have done? Go ahead, jot it down or just think it through for a moment. All right, now that you've had a moment to think about what you might have done, let me tell you what I'd do differently, knowing what I know now. Back then, I was determined to make the meeting work. I had a plan, an agenda, an optimistic belief that if I just kept the energy positive, the resistance would fade. But here has what I've learned since then. You cannot force connection. You cannot push trust. And you definitely can't lead through resistance by pretending it isn't there, no matter how optimistic and positive you are. In that moment, the best thing I could have done was to stop the meeting right after the second customer's comment, with everyone nodding. I should have paused and said something like, you know what? It sounds like everyone's really clear on their focus this week, and that's great. Let's wrap up for now. Then I would have ended the meeting right there. Would it have been awkward? Yes, very much so. But leadership requires learning to be comfortable with awkward moments. Because when something feels off, forcing your way through it does not solve it. It just pushes the problem further down the road. And sure enough, that is what happened for me. After that meeting, I would have called the individual who was clearly influencing the group into my office for a one-on-one conversation. Not to scold her, not to put her in her place, but to understand. I would have said something like, hey, I can sense some tension in the room, and I'd really like to understand what's going on. Can you help me see things from your perspective? And then I would have listened, because in most cases, resistance isn't about defiance. In this one, it was about loss. The team had lost a leader they loved. They weren't rejecting me, Jamie. They were grieving him. And until I understood that, I couldn't lead them forward. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, a meeting that's going sideways, a conversation filled with subtle resistance, or a team that is just not engaging, pause. You do not have to power through. You don't have to win the moment. Sometimes the most effective leadership move is the simplest one. End the meeting, regroup, and come back to the heart of what's really going on. Because that's where real leadership begins, in those quiet moments of reflection and understanding. Now let's shift to a story where, thankfully, I handled things a little bit better, but it was not easy. At another organization, we were planning for a company-wide luncheon. I had placed the event on my team's calendars to hold the time, but I made one small mistake. I accidentally put it in for 60 minutes instead of 90. A simple oversight. But one team member took it personally. She believed I was intentionally trying to shorten her time at the luncheon, that somehow I didn't value her being there. Her manager came to see me and said she was upset. I said, I'm happy to talk with both of you and talk with her through it. They came into my office. The team member sat down, and before I could even say hello, she started yelling. Jamie, you are the worst leader I have ever had in my life. I have never worked for someone as bad as you or as mean as you. And she just kept going on. Loud, emotional, angry, yelling. Now, in my head, I'm going to be really honest with you, I had a quick sarcastic thought. I wanted to say, well, this is your first job, so technically I'm your first leader, but I didn't say it because that's leadership too, recognizing that you may think something human and defensive, because guess what? We are human and we do get defensive, but choosing to rise above it in the moment and not saying it, that's leadership. So I let her talk. When she finally stopped, I took a slow breath and said calmly, thank you for sharing that with me. That makes me sad because I don't want to be a bad leader. I spoke gently, not defensively, and I added, can you help me understand what I've done that makes you feel that way? She hesitated and finally said, I don't know. I just know you're the worst. So I replied, I really want to understand and make this right, but I can tell you're upset right now. How about we take a week and you think through the specific examples of what I've done to make me the worst leader you've ever had, and then let's meet again and talk about it. She agreed. I set the meeting for 1 week later, and this time I booked a conference room instead of my office. I wanted it neutral ground and not be, my space and therefore my power. When she arrived, she had a list in her hand. I thought, oh boy, here we go. We sat down and I thanked her for being willing to share her perspective. As we walked through her list, it quickly became clear that many of the things she was angry about weren't decisions I had made. They were company policies, structural changes, and decisions made by others. Finally, I paused and I asked, "Can I ask you something? Are you happy in your job?" She looked at me and said, "No." So I asked, "What kind of work would make you happy?" That question changed everything. Her entire demeanor shifted, her voice softened. She started describing a completely different type of role, something that she was passionate about, something that lit her up. And as she spoke, I remember thinking, I have never seen her so alive. So I told her, "You're glowing right now. Let's talk about how you can move in that direction. That's the job you need to be in." And we made a plan. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks, hear me, okay? She came running into my office. She threw her arms around me in a big hug and said, "Jamie, you are the best boss I've ever had. I got the job I wanted." She told me she would have never explored her options if I hadn't encouraged her to do so. Wow. That experience taught me something that has stayed with me ever since. She wasn't angry at me. She was angry around me. She was in a job that didn't fit her, and I happened to be the person standing closest to her frustration. And here's the thing. As leaders, we often personalize someone's emotions. We assume it's about us, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's about their season, their fit, their circumstances, and we just happen to be the mirror that reflects it back. Still, you'll never know that unless you're willing to first ask, could it be me? That's humility. That willingness to start with yourself is what opens the door to truth, to trust, to transformation. If I had responded with defensiveness, I would have never gotten her to open up. So here's the reflection for this week. Think of a time when someone said something inappropriate, rude, or unfair to you. How did you respond in the moment? What might you do differently next time? 2, when you feel attacked or criticized as a leader, pause and ask, is this really about me? Or is there something deeper I can help uncover? And remember, leadership isn't about always having the perfect response. I have not always had the perfect response. It's about doing your best to stay calm in the storm. It's about leading with empathy. And it's about choosing curiosity over defensiveness. Because in the end, the way you handle the hardest moments often says more about your leadership than all the easy ones combined. Both of those stories, the one I wish I'd handled differently and the one I'm proud of, taught me something I'll never forget. Leadership isn't measured by how well you lead when everyone agrees with you. It's measured by how you respond when they don't. And believe me, there will be plenty of times when they don't. When someone says something inappropriate, unkind, unfair, your reaction in that moment reveals more about your leadership than their words ever could. Here's what I've learned. You can't control what someone else says or does. You can't. Don't try. But you can control your composure. You can choose your response. And you can choose to listen long enough to uncover what's really going on underneath the words. Because sometimes what sounds like defiance is really disappointment. Think about my 2 examples. What looks like disrespect is actually grief. And what feels like conflict might just be a cry for clarity. So the next time someone crosses a line, take a deep breath, step back, and lead from curiosity instead of control. Ask yourself, what's really happening here? What might this person be carrying? And what can I learn from this moment as a leader? That's where growth happens. That's where relationships are strengthened. And that's where real leadership begins. Thank you for listening. If today's episode resonated with you, share it with another leader who might need the reminder that even the hardest moments can become our greatest. This is Leadership and Learning with Dr. JBT signing off.